The day my daughter was born was truly the happiest day of my life. Most of my friends at the time who already had kids kept reminding me that fatherhood wasn't easy. They often said that once I got past her adorable first year, I'd have to deal with the terrible twos, then the tricky threes, and so on and so forth. I didn't really listen to their warnings as I knew full well that fatherhood was going to be hard, but despite that, I was sure I was going to be able to handle anything that was thrown at me. However, as my daughter grew older, I soon realized how wrong I was. She said something that changed the trajectory of my life forever. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what a 5-year-old could have possibly said that could alter and change my life so profoundly. But the words my daughter said make no sense to me at the time. It happened one Thursday evening. We were sitting on the couch playing with her toys when my daughter suddenly looked me in the eyes and said, "Dad, do you know that the man from the moon sleeps in my bedroom?" I can still remember my wife laughing at our daughter's odd statement before asking what she was talking about and why she was making such strange jokes. But my daughter Lizzie told us it wasn't a joke, and she was really adamant about it, as she swore to us that she was telling the truth. I initially thought the strange statement was just the ramblings of an imaginative child during her curious years. But in the months that followed, my daughter's peculiar statement caused a huge ripple effect, as it eventually led me down a rabbit hole that made me question everything I'd ever known or been led to believe in my life. During this time, I began to wonder if the earth I stood on was actually there, or if the vast universe that surrounded me was even real. Things only got worse, as at some point, I started to ask myself if my daughter and I existed on the same dimensional plane. I'm pretty sure whoever is listening to this story is questioning how the meaningless ramblings of my 5-year-old daughter could send me into such a drastic manic episode. But the thing is, it wasn't just her words that caused it all. No. What sent me off the edge was when her supposed meaningless ramblings became a reality. To understand how it all happened, I'll need to take you a few months back before I almost lost my mind. It all began a few weeks after my wife had brought our daughter a diary. She'd been meaning to get Lizzie a diary for some time now because she had one when she was growing up, and she thought it would serve as a good outlet for our daughter to express herself and write down her thoughts or feelings. I initially believed getting our daughter a diary wasn't really necessary at her age, as I felt like she'd rather play with her toys or watch the telly than write in the diary. However, I hoped the diary could potentially help her writing skills. In the days that followed, my daughter pretty much ignored the diary that had been given to her, just as I'd expected. Even with my wife's constant attempts to convince our daughter to use the diary, Lizzie often preferred to play outside or with the toys in her room. However, that all suddenly changed when I came into her room one day and saw her writing in her diary out of the blue. I remember my wife being so ecstatic that our daughter was finally putting the diary she bought to use. I didn't really think much of it at first, as I assumed she'd be back to playing with her toys in a few minutes. But to my surprise, that didn't happen, and I began to get curious when Lizzie stayed in her room writing in her diary for hours on end until it was finally time for dinner. I wondered what my daughter could have been writing about for such a long time. So when my wife called her out for dinner, I asked her if anything really important had happened during the day that she'd spent such long hours writing about it in her diary. Lizzie then simply told me that she'd been writing about her new friend. I found this a little odd and out of character, as Lizzie was a bit of an introverted child who usually kept to herself. So I asked her if she met a new kid in her class, but she told me that she hadn't met this new friend at school. Confused, I wanted to ask a few more questions so I could know where my daughter had met this new friend, but my wife put a stop to my inquiries, saying that everything our daughter wrote in her diary was private, and that was the end of it. The very next day after my daughter had come back from school, we were both sitting on the couch playing with her toys, when out of the blue she looked at me and said, "Dad, do you know the man from the moon sleeps in my bedroom?" Confused, I asked, "What do you mean by that, sweetie?" My daughter then told me that there's supposed to be a man from the moon living in her bedroom, and he was the new friend she'd been writing about in her diary. It was at this point that my wife laughed and asked my daughter why she was cracking odd jokes. My daughter then adamantly told us that she wasn't joking and insisted that this man from the moon had been following her around and sleeping in her bedroom. I'd never seen my daughter so sure of anything before, and I tried to calm her down by saying, "Sweetie, there are no men on the moon. That doesn't make any sense." But even after I'd tried to explain things to her, she didn't believe me. I spoke to my wife about the whole thing that night before we went to bed, and she assured our daughter could be having an imaginary friend, or she might just be playing a prank on us. However, I could tell when my daughter was lying, and I was certain she wasn't making this up, so I decided to investigate a bit further just to put my mind at ease. I knew my wife had said the diary she bought for our daughter was private, but I also knew the answer to my daughter's recent strange behaviors was in those pages. So when she went to school the following morning, I went to her room to read through what she'd been writing in the diary, and what I saw horrified me. There were several simple but oddly descriptive pages written on the supposed man from the moon that she'd been talking about. One of the earliest entries detailed the first time she met him. While she'd written it all out in basic grammar, I could deduce that this supposed man from the moon had apparently been looming over her bed one night after appearing out of nowhere. She wrote about how scared and frightened she was, but he told her not to scream and that he was a friend. There were several other pages that detailed how their friendship grew, but the entry that alarmed me the most was what my daughter wrote the night before. As I said earlier, most of this was written in crude and basic English, since she was 5. But even then, the descriptive nature of it painted a very clear picture, as the entry pretty much read, "The man from the moon wasn't happy that I'd told Daddy about him. He said Daddy wouldn't understand, so I had to keep him a secret. He then told me that he wanted to show me something and asked me not to scream. He took off his helmet and showed me his face for the first time. I didn't scream, but I was scared because his skin was blue and he had several eyes on his face. His lips were also at the top of his head, and he had 4 tongues in his mouth with no teeth in sight, but I could still understand everything he'd said to me. After showing me his face, the man from the moon told me that I should still remain calm and that he wanted to show me a picture. He then slowly removed his white suit and took out his left arm. The fingers on his hands looked like long blue worms. He then placed 2 of his fingers on his eyes, and I could somehow feel his fingers touching my brain. I don't know what he was doing, but I could see pictures of his family in my head. He then told me that one day he'd take me to the moon to see them. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and I couldn't wrap my brain around how my 5-year-old daughter was coming up with things like this. As I flipped through the next few pages, I saw crude drawings of the things she'd written down that happened with the man from the moon. Due to her basic grammar and sentences, I wasn't completely sure I was making sense of my daughter's writings, but the drawings left no room for misinterpretation, as even though they were crude drawings, they painted a much clearer picture of what supposedly happened in her bedroom last night. My mind began to go to the darkest places, as I knew my daughter couldn't be coming up with things like this by herself. She was an imaginative child, but this was too far, and I began to think all of this, particularly the sentences where she said, "placed his 2 fingers on my eyes," and I could somehow feel his fingers touching my brain, were metaphors for something sinister that was happening in school with an older teacher or a stranger she'd met. I immediately carried out a personal investigation in the following days as I visited her school to check on things, and I even told her mother that I'd personally make time from work to pick her up after her classes were over, as I wanted to make sure she wasn't meeting or talking to any strangers after school hours. However, despite all my efforts, everything seemed to be in order, and I slowly started to believe that all of the eerie descriptions and drawings of this supposed man from the moon were all a figment of my daughter's vivid imagination. In an effort to get my daughter's mind off the bizarre and strange things that she'd been writing about in her diary, I planned an outing that weekend. And when Saturday finally arrived, I took her to a place called Burgh Marsh. The Burgh Marsh was a place located in the northwest of England. It was one of the best spots in England for outings, and its lush marshlands and scenic view made it a perfect spot to go for leisurely strolls that could help clear the mind. I'd planned a little picnic for the family and brought all my daughter's favorite snacks. After we'd eaten and played around, I held my daughter in my arms and said, "Listen closely, Elizabeth, and always remember that no matter what is going on in your life, I want you to know that I love you more than anything in the whole world, and you can always come to talk to me about anything that you need to talk about." We then shared a long hug, and before leaving the Burgh Marsh, We took a few pictures to remember the trip. Some of my favorite photos were the ones I took of Elizabeth sitting in front of the vast empty marshlands. My wife, who was standing behind me, said the car was packed and we were ready to go, so we all went home. It was a really nice trip, and I knew Elizabeth enjoyed the family outing as she kept talking about it on our way home. I was just glad I had taken her mind off this imaginary man from the moon that she was obsessed with, and I was ready to put the whole chapter behind me. Unfortunately, while I didn't know it at the time, the story with this man from the moon had just begun. It all started after the photos of our trip were developed. Most of the pictures were fine, but out of the 3 pictures that I took of Elizabeth sitting in front of the marshlands, there was something very odd that appeared in one of them. As I said earlier, the pictures of Elizabeth were my favorite, and I'd taken about 3 of them with her sitting in the same position. The first and the third images were fine, but it looked like someone appeared out of nowhere and was standing behind Elizabeth in the second image. It took me a while to wrap my head around it, but this unidentified individual was wearing what seemed to be a white spacesuit. My heart dropped to my stomach as I didn't want to believe it. I immediately called Kodak and asked if someone had tampered with the photo or if there was a problem with the Kodak camera I used to take the pictures. After the picture was analyzed thoroughly by the photo analyst at Kodak, they confirmed that the picture was genuine and hadn't been tampered with. My camera was also inspected, and it was perfectly fine. I remember the feeling of terror that filled every inch of my body, as I now knew that every disturbing thing that my daughter wrote about the man from the moon wearing a white spacesuit was real. I went to the police to see if they could do anything about the situation, but after examining the photo, the officers told me that there was nothing suspicious about it, and unless I'd actually seen this mysterious spaceman around my daughter and knew where to find him, there was nothing they could do. Due to my police report, the story was picked up by our local newspaper, and after a few hours, it was all over the world. Even with the photo now out in the world, there was still no explanations as to who or what that spaceman was. I began to question everything around me, as I wondered if I was living in a simulation and if the world or the universe were even real. I kept on asking myself why my 5-year-old daughter was the only one who could see or perceive this spaceman, and it made me delve down a rabbit hole of alternate dimensions. Things only got worse from there, as in the weeks that followed the release of the photo, 2 strange men showed up at my door in suits, telling me that they were from the government. They refused to show me their ID when I asked, and they told me to take them to the place where the photo was taken. I was suspicious, but they were very coercive, so I got in the car and showed them the way. When we got to the Berg Marsh, I told them that I didn't see the mysterious spaceman behind my daughter when I was taking the pictures, and that he only appeared in the photo after it had been developed. The 2 men then got furious for seemingly no reason. I tried to explain the whole thing again, but they got in their car and drove away, leaving me there alone. After I'd managed to find my way home, I decided to finally speak to Elizabeth. She didn't talk much about the spaceman from the moon anymore, and she just told me that he left, but he'd be back soon. In the months that followed this incident, I kept receiving a barrage of letters from several people all over the world who'd seen the image, telling me about their theories and beliefs about the strange spaceman standing behind my daughter in the photo. I tried to shelter Lizzie from the chaos of the picture, as I didn't want her entire childhood to revolve around this strange photo. I tried my best to make sure everything went back to normal. Over the years, the hype and frenzy surrounding the photo died down. Elizabeth is older now, and she's pretty much forgotten about most of the whole ordeal. Even though it's all behind us now, there's a small part of me that's living in anxiety as I know that there's an extraterrestrial life form out there that once visited Earth and became fascinated with my daughter. While I don't know where he is now or what he's doing, I'm still extremely worried that this life form that I only know as the man from the moon might one day come back and take my daughter from my arms, just like he promised to do all those years ago. On the 23rd of May, 1964, a fireman, local historian, and photographer, Mr. Jim Templeton, took a picture of his 5-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Templeton, at a place called Berg Marsh. Berg Marsh is located by Berg by Sands and overlooks the Solway Firth in Cumberland, England. Out of the 3 photos taken by Mr. Templeton that day, a mysterious spaceman-looking figure appeared out of nowhere behind Elizabeth in the second image. Mr. Templeton carried out his own investigations to prove the authenticity of the image, and Kodak themselves confirmed that the photo was genuine. Once word had gotten out, the bizarre image took the entire world by storm as everyone tried to come up with an explanation for the mysterious spaceman that was now widely known as the Soloway Firth Spaceman. There have been several theories surrounding the identity of the strange spaceman. One of the most popular theories was by UFO book author and journalist David Clark. Mr. Clark tried to debunk the photo by saying that the spaceman is just an overexposed image of Mr. Templeton's wife, Miss Annie Templeton, who walked into the shot when the photo was taken, and Jim didn't see her. However, Mr. Clark's theory was widely believed to be wrong and far too speculative because Jim himself had seen their entire surroundings before taking the picture, and his wife Annie was nowhere near their daughter Elizabeth when the photo was taken. Other records also show that his wife was actually behind him and packing the car while the photo was being taken. Despite Mr. Clark's attempts at trying to debunk the photo, he also stated that the Soloway Firth spaceman photo is widely renowned and people will still be talking about it in another 50 years. Over the years of his life, Mr. Jim Templeton was sent thousands of letters from all over the world from people trying to explain the Soloway Firth spaceman, with most of them making little sense to him. Even with his own theories, he could never really come up with a plausible explanation for the spaceman, and after living a long life, he died at the age of 91 on the 27th of November 2011. His daughter Elizabeth, who is now a full-grown adult and widely known as Elizabeth Dobson, said she doesn't really remember much from that time. Before her father's death, both Elizabeth and Jim were interviewed by a Scottish weekly newspaper known as the Dumfriers Courier. In this interview, Elizabeth made a comment to the interviewer saying, "We got a lot of hassle from people like you, but I was really young and can't remember much. I think it was somebody from another planet. It is pretty selfish of us to think that we are the only intelligent form of life."
It was a cold November morning in Perugia when I woke up to the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but watchful. The street outside was still. No clatter of scooters, no shouts from the corner cafe. Just a pale gray light filtering through my curtains and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I padded out into the hallway, my bare feet on the cold tile, the air faintly smelling of damp stone and laundry powder. Meredith's door was shut. That wasn't unusual, but something about it felt heavier than normal, like the air on that side of the hall had thickened. I called her name softly, more out of habit than concern, and got no answer. In the bathroom, a small streak of blood marked the side of the sink. Just a smear, as if someone had wiped their finger across it. My first thought was that Meredith had cut herself shaving, but the coppery smell lingered just a second too long. The front door was ajar, only by an inch, but enough for a draft to slip in. I frowned and shut it. I remember thinking maybe one of the others had gone out and forgotten to close it fully. The place was quiet, though. Amanda's room was empty. I poured myself some water, trying not to think about the blood in the sink. The glass was cold in my hand, and as I drank, I could hear faint footsteps above, or maybe just the creak of the old beams. By mid-morning, Amanda and Raphael were back. They moved through the kitchen talking low, their words too soft to catch, their expressions tight but not fearful. When I asked if they'd seen Meredith, Amanda shrugged, eyes darting to Raphael before saying she hadn't. There was an awkward pause. Then they started tidying the kitchen together, like they were distracting themselves. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't name it. Maybe it was the way Raphael didn't look at me in the eye, or the way Amanda's laugh came too quickly when I joked about the murderous Perugia draft from the open door. It was around lunchtime when I decided to call Meredith. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I sent her a text message. "Hey, you around? The door was open this morning." Still nothing. My stomach felt tight. Amanda suggested we check her room. We knocked. No reply. The handle wouldn't turn. It was locked. I remember pressing my ear to the wood, straining to hear movement. Nothing, just silence, deep and absolute. Amanda called the police, telling them there might have been a break-in. The officers arrived quickly. 2 local men in dark uniforms, their boots loud on the tile. They noticed the broken window in one of the other rooms, glass scattered across the floor. One of them frowned at the lock on Meredith's door and asked if we had a spare key. We didn't. They called in someone to force it open. I stood in the hallway, the walls pressing in, my breath shallow. Amanda had stepped back, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Raphael was watching the floor. I heard the splinter of wood as the door gave way, and then nothing, just a heavy pause. The first officer didn't speak right away. He froze in the doorway, his shoulders tense. Then he turned his head slightly and muttered something in Italian, low and sharp. I stepped forward before he could stop me. The room was dim, the shutters half closed, the air cold. Meredith was on the floor, her body twisted, partially covered by a duvet. There was so much red. Not fresh, bright red, but dark, clotted patches staining the sheets, the pillow, her hair. The metallic smell hit me like a slap strong enough to taste. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and there was something about the way her arm was bent that made my knees weaken. I backed out, the edges of my vision swimming. The officers moved quickly then, speaking into radios, their voices clipped and urgent. One of them herded us into the kitchen. Amanda sat at the table, staring at her hands. Raphael leaned against the counter, chewing his lip. I couldn't look at either of them. Outside, the sky had turned the color of wet cement. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. The cold seeped in through the glass window, and I realized I was still barefoot. I could hear more footsteps now, heavier ones, more officers arriving. As they moved in and out, I caught fragments of their words. Coltellate, assassino. The words landed in my gut like stones. Murder. Stabbing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a stranger slipping in for a quick theft. I thought about the blood in the sink that morning, the open door, the way Amanda had laughed too quickly, the silence behind Meredith's door. I thought about how close I had been to her all night, just a thin wall between us, while something unthinkable happened on the other side. When they finally let us go outside, the courtyard was crowded with uniforms and neighbors craning their necks. The November air was sharp in my lungs. I stood by the gate, looking back up at our windows, the one with the broken glass, the one still closed tight behind shutters. Even now, I can hear the hollow sound of the door giving way, the stillness that followed, the weight of that room pressing into me before I even saw her, and I can't stop thinking. The signs were there, in the smallest details, and I walked right past them. The cold was the worst part of it. Not the fear, not the darkness, not even the sound of his footsteps above me, but the cold that seeped through the concrete floor and into my bones until I couldn't remember what warmth felt like. Been counting days by scratching marks into the wooden beam near my mattress, thin lines that represented mornings. I woke up still breathing, still hoping someone would find me. 88 marks. 88 days since the night he broke down our door and took everything from me. It happened so fast I barely understood it was real. One moment I was in my room doing homework, playing music softly through my headphones, and the next I heard my mom's voice calling out in confusion and fear. I pulled off my headphones and heard the front door splintering, heavy boots on our wooden floors, and then sounds I can't describe without my chest tightening. I wanted to run to them, to help, but my body betrayed me and I just sat there, frozen, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for it to open. When it finally did, he was standing there in dark clothes and a mask, and he looked at me like I was something he'd been searching for his entire life. He told me not to scream, not to fight, that if I stayed quiet, everything would be okay. But I'd already heard the silence downstairs, the kind of silence that meant my parents weren't coming to save me. He dragged me outside and shoved me into the trunk of his car, and the last thing I saw before he slammed it shut was my house, with all the lights still on, looking exactly the way it always had, like nothing terrible had just happened inside. The drive felt endless, my body cramped and aching in the darkness, and when he finally stopped and opened the trunk, I saw we were deep in the woods, surrounded by trees so thick I couldn't see the road anymore. There was a cabin, small and falling apart, and he pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. "This is your home now," he said, "and you'd better get used to it." The cabin had almost nothing in it, just a bare mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and boarded-up windows that let in thin streams of light during the day. He kept me under the bed most of the time, said I had to stay quiet when he had visitors or went to work, that if anyone heard me, he'd have to hurt them, and it would be my fault. I learned his routine quickly, because survival meant paying attention, learning when he'd be gone and when he'd be back, what made him angry and what made him ignore me. He worked during the day sometimes, left me alone for hours with nothing but the sound of wind rattling the boards, and my own thoughts spiraling into darker and darker places. I tried to keep myself together by thinking about my parents, about my friends at school, about the life I'd had before this became my entire world. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, those memories started to feel like dreams, like they'd happened to someone else. I forgot what my mom's voice sounded like, forgot the layout of my own house, forgot what it felt like to walk outside without fear. All I knew was the cabin, the cold, the waiting. But I never stopped looking for a way out, never stopped watching him for mistakes, for moments when his guard dropped just enough. The escape came on a day that felt like any other. He'd been careless, left the door unlocked when he was distracted with something outside, and I didn't hesitate. I slipped out from under the bed, moved as quietly as I could across the floor, and when I reached the door, I ran. I ran through the woods in socks and thin clothes, branches tearing at my skin and my lungs burning from the cold air. But I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going. I just followed the sound of what I hoped was a road. And when I finally stumbled onto the pavement, I saw a house with lights on and a woman outside walking her dog. I ran toward her, my voice barely working, begging her to help me, to call the police. She looked terrified at first, probably thinking I was crazy or drunk. But then she saw my face, and something in her expression changed. She brought me inside, wrapped me in blankets, and called 911 while I sat shaking on her couch, unable to believe I was finally free. The police came fast, asked me where I'd been held, and I told them everything I could remember about the cabin and the route I'd taken. They found him that same day, arrested him without a fight, and when they searched the cabin, they found all the evidence they needed. My clothes, my belongings, proof that I'd been there for months. The news called it a miracle, said I was lucky to be alive. But luck isn't the word I'd use. Luck is winning the lottery or finding money on the street, not surviving 88 days in hell and managing to run fast enough when the door finally opened. I'm safe now, living with relatives far from Wisconsin, going to therapy twice a week and trying to remember how to be a normal teenager. But some nights, I still wake up cold, still feel like I'm back at that cabin, waiting for his footsteps, and still count the days in my head even though I don't need to anymore. Because freedom isn't just about escaping. It's about learning to believe you deserve it. and I'm still working on that part. My name is Rachel. I worked as a 911 operator until everything collapsed because of one mistake I can't erase. I was trained to handle emergencies, but the truth is that after years of picking up calls, you start treating people like background noise. I convinced myself that I was immune, that I could judge what mattered and what didn't. That night, I proved how wrong I was. The room was quiet, a slow shift with barely any calls. I leaned back in my chair, half listening to the operators around me as they talked about nothing important. I wasn't focused, wasn't ready. The call came in and I answered without even straightening my back. A woman's voice came through the line. It was trembling, fast, desperate. The kind of voice you can barely understand because panic makes words stumble. I should have taken it seriously from the first second. Instead, I spoke to her like I was bored. That single choice stayed with me forever. Her name was Jessica. She whispered that her husband had been beating her for months, and that night he had locked their daughter in the bedroom. I heard the way her breath kept breaking between words, but I still acted like I needed confirmation, like she might be exaggerating. She said he was drunk, that he had something heavy in his hand, and that she didn't think she would make it through the night. My system showed the address. I could have dispatched a unit immediately. Instead, I pressed her for details, asking questions that wasted time. The sound on the line shifted. Her voice lowered further, almost impossible to hear, and she said he was coming back into the room. She begged me to send help fast. I told her to calm down. I told her to call back if it got worse. Then the line went dead. I logged the call as domestic disturbance, low threat. That entry sealed her fate. 2 days later, I saw the footage. A neighbor had filmed it through a window, the video shaky and blurred. Jessica ran barefoot across the yard, dragging her little girl with both hands. Her face was twisted in terror, her steps clumsy like she barely had control of her body. Behind them, a man burst out of the house with a tool in his hand. He caught up to her before she reached the fence. The clip ended there. The news confirmed she was dead, and her daughter was in foster care. The audio of the call leaked. It spread across news channels and social media. I listened to my own voice dismissing her over and over while people online screamed for my blood. They called me a murderer, a failure, a monster. The department fired me and left me to rot. I thought the shame was unbearable, until the letters started. The first one slid under my door. It said, "You killed my sister." No name, no explanation, just that sentence written in marker. The next one came 2 days later. "You will beg like she begged." The moment I read that, I couldn't breathe properly. Every noise in my apartment made me jump. I began hearing steps in the hallway at night. Sometimes I thought someone was standing outside my door, waiting. I forced myself to believe it was paranoia, until the third letter arrived. The one that said, "When I see your fear, I will see hers again." The words made me shake because they weren't just threats. They were personal, filled with grief, twisted into rage. I realized Jessica had a brother, and he had decided I was going to pay for her death. The harassment grew worse each night. My phone rang at random hours, and the silence on the other end felt heavier than screams. Knocks at my door came at 3 a.m., soft at first, then harder, always stopping before I could open it. One night I heard something scraping against my window. I lived on the second floor. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the squeal of metal dragging against glass. When I turned the light on, It stopped, but I knew someone had been there. I carried a kitchen knife everywhere inside the apartment. My hand shook whenever I held it, and I hated how powerless I felt. But there was no choice. I had no job, no money, nowhere to go. The world outside had turned its back on me, and inside these walls I was hunted. The breaking point came when I stepped outside for groceries. Across the lot, a man leaned against a car, watching me. His head tilted just slightly, and I felt his stare digging into me. I dropped the bags and ran back upstairs. That night, he spoke under my window.
Her screams echo every time I close my eyes. You will give me that same echo before I end you.
I barely slept after that. Every sound in the building felt like him moving closer. I sat by the door, gripping the knife, my chest burning from the tension. The attack didn't creep, it exploded. A crash of glass shattered the kitchen, and I heard heavy steps rushing through my apartment. His breathing was rough, animalistic, filled with hatred. I stumbled into my bedroom and locked the door, my heart hammering like it would rip through my chest. He pounded against the door, each hit splintering the wood. His voice roared through the cracks.
You sat there while she begged. You let her die alone. I hear her in my head every night. And tonight, I'll hear you.
I pressed the knife against my leg, but my hand shook so much I thought I'd stab myself. The frame was breaking. I knew the door wouldn't last. I forced myself to grab the phone and dial 911. My voice was a broken mess when the operator answered. The woman on the line didn't dismiss me. She didn't waste a second. She told me to stay low, to keep the phone near, to breathe slower so he wouldn't hear me. Her voice stayed calm while the wood cracked behind me. The door burst open. He rushed in, his eyes wide, his face twisted, not only in rage, but in grief. In his hand he gripped a heavy wrench, swinging it high. He looked at me like I was Jessica, like by hurting me he could bring her final moments back and change them.
You don't deserve to breathe when she's in the ground.
Before he brought the weapon down, the flashlight beam of officers cut through the room. Shouts filled the air. They tackled him, wrestling the wrench away as he screamed my name like it burned in his throat. They dragged him out while he cursed me, swearing he could still hear Jessica in my voice. I later learned his name was Alan, Jessica's brother. He died that night after attacking officers at the station. His rage was consuming him. Even in his last moments, I survived. But the world doesn't mean what it used to. I live with the weight of Jessica's voice, with the image of her running across that yard replaying in my head, and with the memory of her brother's eyes staring at me like I was the murderer he needed to destroy. The little girl was adopted. I saw a photo of her months later, smiling beside strangers who would never know what she had lived through. I hope she never learns my role in it. Sometimes I listen to the audio of my own call. The night I begged for help while the door broke down. I hear the operator guiding me, treating me with the urgency I once denied another woman. That voice kept me alive. That voice did for me what I failed to do for Jessica.